Greeting, wonderful listeners. Get ready for an exciting dive into the heart of one of the most important global challenges. Welcome to the second episode of the Infinite Insight podcast. I'm Ali, CEO and founder of Sunyu Consultancy Services, which is an early stage startup committed to crafting sustainable development solutions, specifically aligned with the United Nations agenda, focusing on goal number one and poverty in all its form everywhere, as well as goal number 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. It isn't just a podcast. It's a dynamic exploration of root causes and finding ingenious solutions for tackling poverty and inequality. And hopefully, that can reshape our world. I'm here because I do believe that public awareness about the sustainable development goals must be raised. But before we embark on this enlightening journey, let me express my sincere gratitude for your heartwarming messages, unwavering support, and invaluable feedbacks. Well, honestly, based of your suggestion, I'm recording this episode in my office to cut out background noises, and hopefully, by using one of the cutting edge AI tools, we're dialing the quality of your auditory experience. So, finger crossed for better sound quality. Uh, there's one thing more before we diving into today's episode, which is I will really appreciate if you guys subscribe to our YouTube channel and share this podcast far and wide. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's quickly recap the previous episode. We started with the definitions of poverty and inequality, and probably as you remember, in the simplest term, poverty is a word we use to describe living in the conditions of people's scarcity of financial resources, essential services, and access to life opportunities. And inequality is a word we use to describe gaps between people, especially between people who don't have much and people who might have a lot. Moreover, we learned that tackling poverty and inequality as a huge global problem is so complicated because poverty and inequality are ultimately about much more than incomes. In our last chat, also I mentioned there is no single way to think about either poverty or inequality. And as you know, when we are talking about poverty and inequality, we are addressing the real challenges faced by real human beings living in a real communities around the world. And also, we took a look a definition of extreme income poverty, which is an absolute benchmark for the most extreme forms of the human deprivations. Finally, we learned there are multiple ways of measuring inequality within and across societies. Now, please fasten your seatbelt for today's episode. Uh, we are going to take a closer look at the national and international poverty line, as well as the poverty gap ratio and some other indicators to measure poverty and inequality to compare the living conditions of people across the countries. And then we want to take a quick tour around the world to see how different regions are doing on poverty and inequality, all with the aims of helping us get a better sense of what each of us can do to make a difference. I mean, believe it or not, change is possible when we stand together. So let us start with the poverty. The simplest term, most common way to measure poverty in a country is by looking at the number of people who are unable to afford the minimum basket of goods and services. Uh, the value of this basket is based on the food bundles, which normally align with the national diet required for basic health activity, aligned with an amount to cover other basic needs. This consumption basket, as it's called, define what is called the national poverty line for the country. The proportion of the total population that lives below the national poverty line is estimated as the poverty ratio for the country. But the cost of food and other basic needs diverge even within the country. I mean, prices are often higher in the cities than in the rural areas because people buying different things. For example, people in cities typically purchase food at markets, whereas in a rural area, people are more likely to grow their own food for consumption. So most countries have urban and rural poverty line, which is account for both differences in bundle of goods and services consumed and the differential price of these goods in urban and rural areas. Now, as you realize, the national poverty line estimates a single number, but we know in a reality, people's incomes are not binary. I mean, they are distributed around and below the poverty line. So, even if a family is below the national poverty line, its level of deprivation could be very different depending on how far below it is, or rather, what is the distance between its income and the value of the poverty line. The poverty gap ratio is another indicator that measures the ratio of the average income of the population below the poverty line as a proportion of the value of poverty line. That means it gives us an indicator to measure the intensity of poverty. There is another common proxy is called food insecurity. This is measured in several ways, but the most common indicators is child malnutrition manifested as child stunting, underweight, and wastage. Child stunting signals the impaired growth and development that children experience from cumulatively poor nutrition, repeated infection, and inadequate psychosocial stimulation. And finally, we want to compare the living condition of people across countries. I mean, how they will best account for different contents in which people around the world a variance of the cost of the essential items like foods and shelter in different countries. In recent decades, a lot of work has been done on this issue of cross-country comparison of poverty. Currently, the international poverty line, as it's called, is calculated at $2.15 daily income, purchasing power parity terms, or in In other words, after accounting for inflation and cost of living difference between countries, but why a seemingly arbitrary number like 2.15? The simplest answer is that the group of economists at the World Bank studies the national poverty line of the 15 countries with the lowest average income and noticed that at that time uh, they all appear to toward around $0.19 in 2011 price adjusted term, and then after the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021, they raised the number to exactly 2.15. So when we are referred to ending extreme poverty around the world, this is what we're talking about: daily income of less than 2.15. No, there is one final added complexity to discuss in our conversation around indicators. Regardless of how we measure poverty or inequality, the indicators don't tell us anything about the attributes of people themselves. Poverty can affect of different regions and identities in a different ways, even if their income or wealth level are somewhat similar. So, a good understanding of this issue requires us to disaggregate these indicators: the poverty rate, poverty gap ratio, and multidimensional poverty index, starting at least by gender, by age, by occupation, and location. The Sustainable Development Goals indicators are designed to report it along gender, age, occupation, and location markers precisely for this reason. Now, let's turn to inequality measure. The common measure of income equality is Gini coefficient. It's named after Italian statistician Corrado Gini, who studied the Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve measures the share of society's income earned by people at a different income level. He developed a very neat index that can measure a society's distribution of income on a scale of 0 to 1. I mean, if everyone has equal income, then this difference is 0. On the other hand, if one person has all income, the index approaches 1. So, a Gini index score of around 0.63 in a country like South Africa suggests a much higher concentration of income among higher earner than a score of around 0.27 in a country like Norway. Inequality can also measure by calculating the ratio of incomes between different segments of population. For example, some people like to look at the ratio of the top 10% to the bottom 10%, or the top 20% to the bottom 20%. Another common measure is the Palmer ratio, which compare this richest 10% of share national income to the poorest 14% share of national income. This tells us just, how far the rich are ahead of people closer to the middle. However, there are more technical measures also used, and I'm going to discuss three of them. The first one is the Atkinson Index. The Atkinson Index measures the degree of society's aversion to inequality. It's calculated by examining the percentage of total income that you will need to forego to have more equality, and it's measured by share of income. The second index is the Theil Index. The Theil Index measures the dispersion of income broken down by population groups or source of income or other dimensions that we might find useful. And finally, the Hoover Index or the Robin Hood Index, as it's known, measure the proportion of all income that would be need to be redistributed to achieve a state of perfect equality. Measure help us get an idea about income distribution within a society or breakdown of incomes between haves or have-nots. But what about the differences between countries? Income per capita, defined as the GDP of a country divided by the population of that country, is a common shorthand indicators to compare income levels across countries. It tells us at a glance the relative wealth of poverty nations adjusted for size. We are done with definitions. Let's do a quick tour around the world to see how different regions are doing on poverty and inequality. As you can see from this map, extreme poverty is concentrated in just a few regions of the world. Since we are comparing across the world, the metric we use here is the 2.15 a day measure, and based on the data we have, you can see that extreme poverty is concentrated in part of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, some landlocked countries in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and a few island states in Pacific and in the Caribbean. This is not to say that poverty doesn't exist in other part of the world, but extreme poverty in a globally comparable sense is clustered by these regions. Let's compare this node to the global map of undernutrition, focusing on child stunting for that moment. And you can see here how closely child stunting track extreme poverty. I mean, about a quarter of the world's children are stunted, with the highest proportion in Eastern Africa, South Asia, and some of the small island states of the Pacific Ocean. Let's look at another global map, this time measuring multidimensional poverty. You can see here that countries with the highest rate of poverty by this measure are in Africa, across Sahelian belt, and spread across the sub-Saharan regions. Notice that these countries correlated closely but are not identical to those in the extreme poverty map. But why do you think this is the case? One reason could be that multidimensional poverty is broader, so it's captured the social provision of goods and services, health, for example, or water and sanitation, and this brings in another variable, which is capacity of the state to provide the services. Let's turn to national poverty line and measurement. We cannot possibly grow through all countries, but let's look at two sets of data. First, this table shows national poverty rate for a sample of countries around the world. The good news is that in most countries, the data are available at the national and subnational levels. The second table shows us the broken down by urban and rural poverty rates. Once we look at this national data, comparing across countries is not as easy since the poverty lines are defined differently for each country, but within country comparison are entirely possible. Look at this map of Ghana, for example. You can see the huge variation in poverty rate by district. Now, let's turn to inequality. Here we see the huge variation in the income between countries, and what we notice is that countries that have low income per capita also have the highest concentration of extreme poverty. Again, not surprising, but as we saw earlier, the distribution of resources are matter much more between the societies. Here, uh, is a ranking of the 20 most unequal countries in the world based on their Gini coefficient. And as you can see, most of them have a score higher than 0.45, indicating a high concentration of income among the wealthiest in the societies. Okay, we're going to look at some trend data. As we learned in the first episode, poverty and inequality are not static in nature. Over the past decade, the inequality between countries has decreased as economic growth accelerated in low and middle income countries. And one of the greatest unheard success story of the past decade is the fall in extreme poverty around the world. Take look at this chart. It shows that globally nearly 1.2 billion people came out of extreme poverty for about 2 billion in 1990s to about 718 million in 2019. This is an achievement of stagnation progression, but of course, this trend is not common to all countries. We have another graph that shows the change in the proportion of the people living under 1.90 in a different region of the world over the same period. And you can see here that the greatest change have taken place in East Asia, the Pacific, as well as in South Asia. The rate of change is slow in sub-Saharan Africa, while some reverse can be seen in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is the fact that inequality data is hard to track over the time. I mean, some indicators such as Gini coefficient can change slowly, but we can get a sense of change when we're looking at the shares of income. So let's look at two other examples. Here is example of Vietnam that's seen very high income growth over the last several decades. The income share of the top 20% declined from 44 to 42.8% over almost 2 decades, and again showing us that inequality is hard to shift. In sharp contrast, India, which saw an enormous fall in extreme poverty uh, over the 3 decades period between the 1980s and 2010. So, in the same period, the share of the top of 10% go up from 26% to about 13%. Okay, seems it's time to wrap up. So let's recap what we learned today. First, there are different ways to measure extreme poverty within country through national poverty line and through rural and urban poverty line. And we can also measure the intensity of poverty through the poverty gap ratio. Moreover, we learned that income poverty is not the only way to think about poverty, and in fact, multidimensional poverty measures give us a broader picture. And also, we learned that international poverty line can help us compare poverty levels across countries. Second, inequality is measured by looking at the share of income owned by individuals and at different income levels, along with several other types of ratio and indices. And finally, we looked at levels and some trends data around the world. We saw that extreme poverty is concentrated in a few parts of the world. Also, we learned national poverty rate often masked variation between countries. And at the end, we saw that while poverty level can change fairly rapidly and fairly substantially, but inequality is hard to change. We have seen very little change or rises in inequality in many parts of the world. Well, that's all. I hope you found today's episode as fascinating as I did. I mean, your support through subscribing and listening means the world to us. And it's truly fueled my passion to keep bringing this conversation on the table. So remember, you are not just the listeners, you are part of the journey. So until the next time, keep curious and stay awesome. I will see you soon.